Well, I think that international NGOs play a number of different roles, depending, of course, on their self-appointed mandate. I think it's important to realize that a lot of NGOs, particularly in the United States, act as pressure groups, and so what they do is they try to get governments and the international community, organizations like the UN and the EU, to intervene and try to stop or prevent conflicts from breaking out in countries like South Sudan or Central African Republic or Syria. And oftentimes they rely on sanctions or they push for sanctions to be imposed in an effort to change the dynamics on the ground. That is something that countries do frequently do. The problem is that oftentimes that's not done in a very sophisticated way, which is where I think another role that NGOs play can be critical, which is that of think tanks. And oftentimes organizations like mine, International Crisis Group, does a lot of work trying to develop more sophisticated strategies for how sanctions can be more effectively used to try to promote peace and stability in African countries and elsewhere. That, of course, is easier said than done, but it's something that is useful vis-a-vis policymakers, particularly because it's often the case that senior politicians just lack the time or the experience or certainly the deep country knowledge that's necessary to come up with sophisticated strategies. And last but not least, I think international organizations oftentimes also play an important role in terms of investigating sanctions violations and coming up and monitoring whether or not actually sanctions regimes are being implemented as they should. So when I first started working on this issue, I worked for an organization called Human Rights Watch, where we did a lot of work trying to identify what countries and companies were providing weapons to human rights abusing groups. And so that was obviously important in terms of pressuring countries to take action on stopping that trade. There are other obviously important organizations that are working on targeted sanctions or trying to prevent natural resource exploitation, which is used to fund abusive groups and regimes. And last but not least, as NGOs, we try to ensure that if countries do impose sanctions, that they do so properly, right? So that it's not just symbolism, but that in fact they put in place the measures to make these sanctions effective. I think that it's very difficult to appreciate whether sanctions are effective or not. Frequently, they're not very effective because they are imposed by governments essentially as a for political expediency, right? In an attempt to try to demonstrate that they are doing something about a conflict that is otherwise very, very difficult to address. And that means that you may have sanctions on the books, but very little is done to make sure that they're being adhered to either by regional states or even by major powers. And that makes it very, very challenging. That said, I think that if sanctions are implemented stringently and there is a great power that makes sure that countries are abiding by those sanctions, they can have a fairly significant impact in terms of changing the political calculations of people who are involved in conflict. And so they can be part of a solution. They can't be the solution by themselves, but in conjunction with other pressure, they can help at least alleviate the situation and preferably end the conflict. Well, it's still a little early to see. I mean, the reality is that all administrations learn over time, and I think they also begin to appreciate the limitations, right? I think that right now, everyone inside the United States and also outside the United States is worried that the United States is going to take a very military approach to resolving its issues in the world. I think slowly the Trump administration will realize that there's only so much that it can do without really upsetting international relations, and so it probably will start looking more at sanctions. That said, you're already seeing the Trump administration, push sanctions on North Korea. But I think that when it comes to Africa, at least, the Trump administration probably will not be using sanctions as much because it sees that part of the world as less strategic, and will try to balance the interests of business and those of NGOs like mine that are pushing for countries to make sacrifices in the interest of peace. So I think it will be a bit of a mixed picture, but hopefully they'll learn. I mean, one of the things we are very excited about is that the Trump administration did permanently lift some of the sanctions that were imposed on Sudan back in the 1990s, and it was in an effort to come up with a more sophisticated strategy of engagement with Sudan to try to move the country in the right direction in terms of inclusive governance, in terms of trying to address some of the grievances that are fueling chronic conflict in places like Darfur and the two areas. But it remains to be seen what will happen. It's still early.